Scots pine, which makes up 17% of Great Britain's conifer area, is the only native conifer used commercially. It's also the dominant tree species in our iconic but severely declining Caledonian pine forests. Climate change, overgrazing by large herbivores and pests, and diseases are all very real threats to the resilience of Scots pine woods and forests, regardless of management objectives.
So one of the aims of this work was to actually use existing records to find out what species did use Scots pine. And we found out that 1,589 species use our Scots pine trees. And that's composed of 17 birds, 130 mosses, 539 fungi, 420 invertebrates, 468 lichens, and 15 mammal species. And that's actually an underestimate because we haven't included all the bacteria, we haven't included all the fungi, we've only included the fungi that are most tightly associated with Scots pine. You won't get all those species on any one tree or in any one woodland. So you might think if we lost Scots pine that we'd be just losing one species, but that's not actually true. There's a whole range of species, as we've been talking about, that use Scots pine, and 215 of them are only found on Scots pine. So if we lose Scots pine, we'd be at risk of losing those other species as well. Our research really showed the importance of the dead wood of Scots pine for hosting biodiversity. So half the invertebrates that use Scots pine are actually using the dead wood of Scots pine, and there's also a huge range of lichens that are also found on the dead wood of Scots pine.
This is Mar Lodge, a large remnant Caledonian pinewood in the Cairngorms and Britain's biggest national nature reserve. It's a landscape where Scots pine, both young and old, are subject to natural processes and an extremely important site for conservation.
So today we're at Mar Lodge Estate, which is a large estate in the Cairngorm Mountains, so it stretches to about 30,000 hectares. And in the estate, one of the key features that we have here is this fantastic Caledonian pine forest that you can see around us. These old granny pine trees, most of which are over 200 years old or so. And this is a priority habitat, the pinewood, and one of the real focus points of the management at Mar Lodge has been to try and restore this woodland because it has declined over the centuries in Scotland. And when the National Trust for Scotland first acquired Mar Lodge, it was only these old big granny pines and there was no young trees at all. And that was really because of the history of heavy grazing by deer on the estate. So what the National Trust has been trying to do is to reduce the deer population here and try to allow the sort of self-seeding and natural regeneration of the forest to occur. But for us, I guess the real take-home message from DiversiTree was about the need to encourage and foster this quite diverse woodland habitat, so not a single species habitat, so that there is some robustness going into the future.
In our conservation site, if you've got more of a conservation management objective, you could consider a lot more shrub species. So we're thinking about things like hazel and rowan and some of the willow species, and they support a lot of biodiversity as well. If you're wanting trees that will also support biodiversity, but potentially provide you with some value for timber, you're thinking of things like oak, Norway spruce, beech, birch less so, but perhaps around the edges of it, and also alder.
We're here in North East Scotland, standing in Speymouth, which is a land management plan that covers multiple forest blocks, which is predominantly Scots pine, but also has multiple Sitka plantations running through it. So we're increasingly looking to diversify our forests to make them more resilient to climate change and plant health, so for example, tree disease. So this can be challenging because Sitka spruce regenerates prolifically, especially where areas open up within the forest and we get these natural kind of forest glades forming, which is more challenging if we're looking to diversify with slower growing species, for example, Scots pine, because that Sitka spruce will then outcompete the Scots pine and you end up with monocultures where you're looking for your diversification.
There is a whole world hidden in plain sight, inhabiting forests and trees in the form of microscopic organisms that make up the tree's microbiome. But what impact would greater tree species diversity in Scots pine forests have on this microscopic world? Different species of trees have different characteristics which make them more or less suitable for different microbes to live on. Microbes are constantly competing for resources like space and a source of energy. Many different strategies have evolved to give different microbes an advantage in different environments, including those living on the trees found in UK woods and forests. These strategies may include mechanisms that make microorganisms such as bacteria or fungi cause tree disease. However, these strategies may also include mechanisms that can control those pathogenic bacteria and fungi, thus contributing to an improved overall health of the tree. If microbial diversity is enhanced, can the greater range of competitive strategies that are present create a solution for bolstering tree health and resilience by keeping the undesirable microbes at bay?
For this study, we used two experimental mixed species plot. One is in northeast Scotland and then the other is in North Yorkshire. And so what we found was quite intriguing. So rather than it being a case of single species versus mixed species plantation, we found that microbial communities across plots and even across forests vary greatly, even when they are dominated by Scots pine. So this variation seems to be driven by forest histories, environmental pressures, and their unique microclimates. What is actually important is which tree species are there and how they interact with each other and how they also interact with the microbial communities that are present.
The extent to which Scots pine woodlands are in need of tree species diversification will depend on the site's objectives and the woodland manager's appetite for risk. If we want to ensure resilience to current and emerging threats like climate change and pests and diseases, it's a management approach that can benefit them. The way this is done, the potential trade-offs, and with which tree species will vary depending on the management objectives for the forest.